Dad married 3 months after my mother's death and tells me to give my room to my stepsister and move out, so I said okay and packed my bags and moved to my uncle's house. Now Dad is going crazy and literally doing everything to convince me to come back, because he just got this in his mail. My mom died about 6 months ago, after a long battle with cancer. She was my rock and we had an incredibly close bond. Losing her was devastating. I'm 19 years old, and until recently I lived with my dad, who was my other rock until this happened. My source of stability. My parents' marriage wasn't perfect, but it was functional enough that I thought they were happy. Losing my mom made our little family seem so much smaller, and for a while, it was just Dad and me trying to figure out life. Then 3 months after Mom died, Dad dropped a bombshell. He was getting married again. I was stunned. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. I felt like he was rushing things. I mean, just a few months ago we were grieving together, and now he was ready to move on. He claimed this woman was an old friend, someone he had reconnected with soon after Mom got sick. I wanted to be open. I understood that everyone grieves differently, and maybe this was his way of coping, but deep down it felt wrong. It felt like he was disrespecting my mom's memory by jumping into a new relationship so quickly. When I tried to tell him this, he launched into a speech about how he deserved to be happy after everything he had been through. I felt my heart sink. I didn't want to start an argument, so I kept quiet. I tried to be mature to avoid conflict, but inside I was a wreck. It was so hard to watch him move on, while I was still dealing with my own grief. It felt like he had replaced my mom with someone new, and I didn't know how to deal with those feelings. Jane moved in almost immediately, along with her daughter, Emily, who was 17. I didn't know much about Emily, but I could see how close she and her mother were. They seemed to have this bond that I felt completely excluded from. Jane was always pleasant, smiling, trying to be friendly, but I could sense that she was trying to assert her dominance over the household in subtle ways. Suddenly there were new house rules, changes to our routines and shifts in the way how everything worked. The familiar comfort of home was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable atmosphere that made me feel like a stranger in my own space. At first I tried to go with the flow, thinking maybe this was just part of the new living arrangements. But the more I watched Jane and Emily settle in, the more alienated I felt. They had their own little world, and I was just an outsider looking in. It was hard to get used to the fact that my father had chosen to prioritize their needs over mine, especially when I was still reeling from the loss of my mom. Then the real bomb dropped. One day, out of the blue, Dad sat me down for a serious talk. I could tell by the look on his face that this wasn't going to be good. He told me that since Emily was moving in, he thought it would be best if I considered moving out to make room for her. I was in disbelief. He was actually suggesting that I give my room to Emily because she needed it more. He told me I could stay with my uncle temporarily while he adjusted to the new living arrangements. I wanted to scream and shout, but I remembered how my dad had reacted the last time I shared my thoughts about his marriage, so I kept calm, at least on the outside. I chose not to argue or get emotional and just said, okay. I packed my bags, called my uncle and moved out. My uncle welcomed me with open arms. He was as shocked as I was when I told him what had happened. It was only when I left that the reality of the situation hit me. My father had chosen his new wife and stepdaughter over me, his own child, just months after my mother had died. The betrayal hurt deeply. I didn't hear from Dad for a few days. I assumed he was relieved that I was gone, without putting up a fight. It didn't seem like Dad cared enough to reach out, and I thought he was happy to have me out of the house. After all, he got what he wanted, didn't he? Emily got my room. Jane got her new life with Dad, and I was out of the way. I remember sitting in my uncle's spare bedroom, staring at my phone, half expecting some sort of apology or explanation, but there was nothing. It hurt more than I expected. It was as if I'd been completely erased from his life. I kept telling myself that I had done the right thing by leaving and trying to focus on settling in with my uncle and keeping up with my college work. Then out of nowhere, the silence broke. One day my phone started to explode with calls and texts from Dad. First I ignored them. I assumed it was more of the same coping talk he'd given me before. But then it became relentless. Missed call after missed call. Message after message. He apologized, asked me to come home, saying things could get back to normal. His tone had completely changed from the day I left, and I started to get suspicious. Why this sudden desperation? I didn't reply at first, but the sheer volume of messages made me curious. Why was he so keen to get me back now? What had changed? I finally gave in and texted him back to ask what was going on. And that's when he told me about the letter. He tried to play it down, but the more he talked, the more I realized that something significant had happened. He mentioned that he had received an official letter from my mother's solicitor, which didn't make much sense to me at first. I knew my mother had a will. She had mentioned it in passing when she was ill, but I hadn't really thought about the details. Apparently that letter was a big deal. My dad explained in a roundabout way that my mom's will had been finalized, and according to the will, my mom had left me her share of the house. This meant that my dad and I were now joint owners of the house. I own half and he owns the other half. So as long as Dad still has his share, he can't sell the house or make any major without my consent. I guess I had assumed that everything would go to Dad, as they were married, but she had made sure I was looked after, and it hit me hard how much thought she had put into it. Even though I wasn't 21 yet, at 19 I had a legal stake in the house. I hadn't realized how important that was until Dad started explaining that he couldn't make any major decisions about the property without my consent. This news completely changed the dynamic. Now that Dad and Jane know that they need me to be in control of the house, they've been bombarding me with calls and texts nonstop. It's not just them either. They've got the rest of the family involved. I get messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all telling me to be the bigger person and go back home for the sake of family harmony. It's overwhelming. I'm a full-time student and I already have so much on my plate with classes, assignments, and trying to juggle a part-time job. The worst part is that Jane has started messaging me too, acting all nice and trying to guilt me into coming back. She's offered to let me share a room with Emily, as if that'll make up for everything. Feels so insincere, like they're just trying to smooth things over, because they realize they've lost control of the situation. They didn't care about my feelings until they realized they needed me. And now they're trying to act like we're all one big happy family. But frankly it's a lot to take in. I didn't ask for any of this, and all I really wanted was some time to grieve and process everything. After losing my mom, I'm stuck in this mess. I feel like I have to fight to hold on to what my mom wanted for me. Now I don't know what to do. The house is legally half mine, but I don't know if I want to go back. First of all, thank you so much for all the support and advice in the comments. Reading through your personal experiences has honestly been one of the few things that has kept me sane over the last few days. It's comforting to know that I'm not alone in dealing with complicated family stuff. And for those asking, my uncle, let's call him Uncle James, is my mom's brother, not my dad's. He's been nothing but supportive, and I'm lucky to have him as a place to stay while I sort all this out. So there's been another development. While my dad's side of the family have not, in their attempts to get me to come back, something interesting happened that I didn't see coming. My mom's lawyer paid me a visit at Uncle James' house. I wasn't expecting it, and to be honest, it kind of took me by surprise. I had only met the solicitor once before, at the reading of my mom's will, but I didn't really think I'd be hearing from him again, at least not anytime soon. So when he turned up, my first thought was that something had gone wrong with the house or my legal rights to it, but it turned out to be something else entirely. Apparently my mom had set up a little trust fund for me, and the solicitor was there to explain the details. My Uncle James is the trustee. That means he's in charge of administering the trust until I'm old enough to manage it myself. The trust isn't anything huge. It is just a small amount of money that my mom put away for emergencies or my future needs. I think she wanted to make sure that I would have something to fall back on, even if things got complicated with Dad in the house. The thing is, I'm not sure my dad even knows about this trust. Mom must have set it up quietly. And since Uncle James is the trustee, it's possible that Dad didn't even know about it. This realization made me feel even more protected by my mom. It was as if she'd planned for every eventuality, even the ones I had never imagined. The trust fund doesn't change anything in terms of my financial situation, but it's reassuring to know that I have some extra security, especially with everything that's going on right now. I haven't told my dad about the trust yet, and to be honest, I'm not sure I should. He's been blowing up my phone with messages, and I've had calls from all sorts of relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles. They are all trying to convince me to come back. First, they were nice about it. They told me that Dad missed me, and that we should patch things up. But when I didn't respond immediately, the tone started to change. Some of them started to make me feel guilty, saying things like, "Your dad is under a lot of stress, and family is more important than a stupid room." I even had one of my aunts tell me that I was being selfish for taking my mom's side, and that I needed to move on. Now that she was gone, it was overwhelming to say the least. But here's the kicker. While all this was going on, Uncle James told me that Dad had tried to contact him. Apparently too, Dad called him and tried to pretend that everything was fine, and asked if I was okay, and if Uncle James could persuade me to come back home. James said it was the most awkward conversation he'd ever had. Dad tried to play the concerned parent, but Uncle James wasn't buying it. He knew how Dad had treated me, and he made it clear to Dad that I was welcome to stay with him for as long as I needed. It's pretty clear that my dad's side of the family are all on his team. They're trying to wear me down, and I have a feeling that it's not just about wanting me back for family reasons. It's about control, just like with the house. I've been thinking a lot about whether Dad knows about the trust or if he's just focused on the house for now. Part of me wonders if the trust would complicate things, even more so if he found out. Right now he's trying to get me to come back. But if he knew about the extra money Mom left me, would it change his tactics? Would he suddenly try to get involved in managing it? Again, I have no idea. But the thought is nagging at me anyway. My lawyer has advised me to keep quiet for now, especially as Dad is so fixated on the house. Legally, he can't force me to move back, and he certainly can't sell the house without my consent. But I can't help but feel like this whole thing is going to get messy, before it gets better. Uncle James has been a rock through all of this, and I'm so grateful to have him in my corner. I don't know what I would have done without him, especially with how manipulative my dad is, and his side of the family. I'm taking things one day at a time. I'm concentrating on school, trying to keep up with my homework, and just taking a breather from all the drama. I think this whole situation has reached its peak of awfulness. Something worse happens, or I learn something that turns my world upside down. I thought things couldn't get any worse after leaving my dad's house, dealing with the nonstop messages from my family, and then finding out about the trust fund my mom had set up for me. But I was wrong. Something happened yesterday that really hit me hard and changed the way I look at everything. That's what happened. One of my cousins on my dad's side, let's call her Sarah, asked me to meet her for coffee. I wasn't sure what to expect, as most of my dad's side have been to go back home, but Sarah and I have always been very close. She's a bit older than me, and we used to hang out a lot when we were younger, so I thought maybe she just wanted to check in and see how I was doing. When we met, it was a bit awkward at first. Sarah's mom, my aunt, was one of the main people who was pressuring me to make up with my dad, so I wasn't sure where this conversation was going. But then out of nowhere, the conversation took a completely unexpected turn, and Sarah dropped a bomb on me I wasn't prepared for. She hesitated at first. She said she wasn't sure if she should tell me what she knew especially since her mom had told her to keep quiet about it, but she couldn't hold it in any longer. She felt that I needed to know the truth. Sarah told me that my dad had been cheating on my mom for a long time, even before my mom got ill. I was devastated. I had no idea it was going on. Sarah said she had known for a while, but didn't want to get involved, mainly because her mom had told her not to. She explained that the day before my mom died, she saw my dad in a restaurant with Jane, and it wasn't just a casual lunch. Sarah said that they looked like a couple. They were sitting close together and talking, and it was clear that something was going on between them. At the time, Sarah didn't think too much about it. Maybe she didn't want to think the worst, or maybe she didn't want to create a drama. But now looking back, it all began to make sense to her. The part that hit me the hardest was when Sarah told me that she finally the courage to tell my mom about what she had seen. I can't even begin to imagine how devastating it must have been for my mom. She was already going through so much with her illness, and on top of that, having to deal with the knowledge that my dad had, emotionally and maybe even physically, before she was gone. Sarah said that after telling my mom, she felt guilty, like maybe she had made things worse. But at the time, she thought it was the right thing to do. She thought my mom had a right to know, even if it caused her pain. But ever since, it weighed on Sarah's conscience, and she struggled with whether or not telling my mom was the right thing to do. When Sarah told me all this, everything started to fall into place. I think that might be why my mom made the decision she did. She probably knew about Dad and Jane in her will, and maybe she didn't trust him anymore. Maybe that's why she left her share of the house to me, instead of leaving everything to Dad. It was her way of protecting me and making sure that if Dad tried to move on too quickly with Jane, I wouldn't be left with nothing. Pains me to think that my mom had to deal with so much behind the scenes. She must have known her time was limited, and on top of that, she had to worry about Dad betraying her trust. I feel like I should have known, but I guess I was too focused on trying to cope with losing her to see the signs. Now all these little things are starting to make sense. The way my mom would, the way she would look at my dad sometimes with the sadness in her eyes, the way she seemed so focused on making sure that everything was in order before she died. Think she knew she had to take care of me because she couldn't rely on Dad to do it. After Sarah told me all this, I felt sick to my stomach. It was like my whole perspective on my parents' relationship had been turned upside down. I had always thought that they had a strong marriage, and I never thought that Dad would be capable of something like this. I don't even know how I feel about him anymore. Part of me is angry that he could betray my mom like that, and part of me is just devastated that my mom had to carry this secret around with her while she was sick. Now I'm starting to wonder, how much did Jane know about all this? Did she know that my mom was still in the picture when she got involved with my dad? Was she just waiting for my mom to die so that she could move in and take over? It makes me feel even more certain that I made the right decision by leaving the house. I don't want to be around people who treated my mom like that, especially not in the home she worked so hard to create for us. Since I found out, I felt even more conflicted about what to do next. I still own half the house, but I don't know if I ever ever want to set foot in it again. How can I live there knowing all this? How can I even look at my dad after finding out what he did to my mom? And now it makes sense why Jane was so eager to get me out of the house. She probably saw me as an obstacle to having the life she wanted. With my dad, Uncle James has been incredibly supportive through all this. When I told him what Sarah had said, he wasn't surprised. He said he always felt something was with my dad after my mom got sick, but he never had any proof. He's encouraged me to take my time about making decisions about the house. And he's even offered to help me talk to a lawyer if I want to take legal action. I'm not sure what I want to do yet, but knowing that I have people like Uncle James and Sarah in my corner makes me feel a little less alone in all of this. Right now I'm just trying to process everything and figure out what my next move should be. I don't think I can forgive my dad, at least not anytime soon. He's been acting like the victim in all of this, acting like I'm the one tearing the family apart. But now I see that he's been hiding so much from me. I think this might be my last update. So after everything that has happened, I decided I needed to have one last with my dad. It wasn't because I wanted to fix anything or make things better between us, but I felt like I needed to say my piece and make it clear that I wasn't going to be part of the life he and Jane were building. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but after finding out about the affair and realizing how much my mom had been through, I knew I couldn't just keep quiet and walk away without closure. I texted my dad and told him I wanted to meet and talk. He responded quickly. I clearly thought this was my way of coming back and reconcile. He and Jane had probably convinced themselves that I just needed time to cool down and that I'd come round eventually. When I turned up at the house, without any bags or signs that I was moving back in, I could see the surprise on their faces. They were expecting me to be ready to move back in, but I wasn't. I sat down with them in the living room, and the atmosphere? Dad tried to make small talk, asking how I was doing, and if I was ready to move on. Jane just sat there kind of fake smiling, clearly uncomfortable, but still trying to pretend that everything was normal. It took everything I had to stay calm and not let my anger take over. But I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them control the story anymore. I told Dad straight out that I knew about the affair, that I knew he had been with Jane while Mom was still alive, and that someone had confirmed it to me. I didn't want to involve my cousin Sarah in the matter, because her mom wouldn't have liked that at all. The look on his face was priceless. He was completely taken by surprise, and for once he had nothing to say. Jane turned pale and tried to deny it, stammering something about how it wasn't what it seemed, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I had heard enough from Sarah to know the truth. I explained that I wasn't there to argue or try to get an apology. I just wanted them to know that I wasn't coming back. I told them that I didn't trust them, that I didn't want any part of this life they had built on lies, and that I wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine, was all right. House, half of it at least, was mine now, and I wasn't going to let them push me out, but I wasn't going to live there either. I told them I'd think about what to do with my share later, but for now I didn't want any contact with them. The only thing that was clear was that no decision was to be made about the house without me, of course. Dad tried to play the victim, saying that I was tearing the family apart, that I was overreacting, and that I needed to think about the future. He even tried to make me feel guilty by saying how hard it had been for him after Mom died, and that he needed someone to lean on, and that's how Jane came into the picture. But I didn't buy it. He had made his choice and now he had to live with it. I didn't want to feel sorry for him when he had clearly disrespected my mom long before she died. As for Jane, she just sat there quietly after I called her out. It was clear that she wasn't going to take any responsibility for what had happened, and I didn't expect her to. Frankly, I don't care what happens. between the two of them at this point. They've made their bed and they can lie in it together. After I had said my piece, I got up to leave. I could see that Dad was still in shock. He probably thought I was going to come crawling back. But that would never happen. I walked out of the house. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. It hadn't been easy, but it felt good to finally have some closure, to say what needed to be said, and let them know that I wasn't going to be a part of in their lives anymore. Since then I've blocked both of them on social media and stopped responding to messages. From my dad's side of the family, it's been mostly quiet, although I've heard from Sarah that Dad has been telling people I'm the one acting out and being unreasonable. But honestly, I don't care. People are going to believe what they want, and I'm tired of trying to explain myself to anyone. As for the house, I haven't made any final decisions, but my lawyer and Uncle James are helping me figure out the best way to handle it. But I've been thinking about either selling my share or renting it out. I don't want to be tied to the house anymore, but I don't want to give Dad and Jane any easy wins. If they want to stay there, they'll have to come to terms with the fact that I still have control over a part of it, and I'm not going to let them make any big without my approval. In the end, I think this whole situation has been a wake-up call for me. I've learned that sometimes the people you trust the most can let you down in ways you never expected. But I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought. I've made it through this mess with my head held high, and I'm ready to move on my own terms. As for Dad and Jane, well, I guess they got what they wanted. But in the end, they've lost something from me. And maybe in time, they'll realize that some things can't be undone. Karma has a way of catching up with people. And while I'm done with them, I can't help but feel that eventually they'll have to face the consequences of their actions. For now, I'm focusing on myself and my future and the people who have been there for me through all of this. I'm not looking back. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for your support, advice, and kind words throughout this ordeal. Reading your stories and knowing I'm not alone in this has meant more than I can express. Your encouragement has helped me stay strong and stand my ground, and for that I'll always be grateful. Thank you for being there when I needed you most.